Welcome to episode 67 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes, and I'm back from my travels, back from Tenerife. If you'd like to listen to how I got on, then go back and listen to episode 66. But in episode 67, we're going to be going to Brittany. Back in 2020, when I was cycling around the UK, up to Edinburgh, then Belfast, then Cardiff, and then finally down to London, when I was cycling up to Edinburgh, I went via the Lake District and I met up with a chap called Tim Boden. Tim had been in contact, he was living up in the area, and he said to me, would I like to go on a guided tour around Ambleside, which is where I was camping. I said, yeah, sure. And he took me on a guided tour down Langdale, up a very, very steep hill, and then we came back to Ambleside via the west coast of Windermere. It was a phenomenally wet day, but he was a great guide. And earlier this year, he gave a talk at the Cycle Touring Festival, the virtual Cycle Touring Festival, and he was talking all about a trip he'd made last year to Brittany. And I thought, this is fascinating. I'd been to Brittany myself in July of last year as part of my grand tour around Europe, and I asked him if he'd like to appear in the podcast to talk about his own journey. He said yes, and that's what we're going to be listening to in today's podcast. We're also going to be listening to two extracts from episodes 55 and 56 of the podcast that I recorded last summer. From episode 55, we're going to be listening to my chat with three French cyclists, and I bumped into them on the north coast of Brittany, and they're talking about their own experiences of cycling in Brittany. We're also going to hear from a chap called Geoff Husband. Geoff runs Breton bikes. He also runs the campsite at Gouarec, which is a place that Tim mentions in the interview that you're about to listen to. So we're actually going to hear from three people, from a French cyclist right at the end, from Geoff Husband in the middle, and to begin with, we're going to hear from Tim Boden, and I asked him to start off by introducing himself.
Hello, I'm Tim Boden. I'm a retired engineer, now living in the Lake District. I probably got into cycle touring about 10 years ago, mostly on organised tours abroad. So the likes of Cuba, Kerala, Myanmar, or Burma as it was, and Jordan more recently. And during lockdown, I created a cycle ride, 8-day cycle ride around London. As part of a scheme to raise money for pancreatic cancer. So I published that around about 2019, 2020 and sold a few books and raised about £3,000 for charity doing it. So that was quite good. Since then, I've moved to the Lake District. Up here, I write guides on gravel routes for people to see, which you can download on the internet. And I've recently, or last summer, been on holiday to Brittany.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to talk about in this podcast, is your visit to Brittany. Basically, on the back of, you've recently done I thought it was a brilliant presentation at the virtual Cycle Touring Festival. You really do know your stuff when it comes to Brittany. So I think anybody listening to this who is wanting to know about Brittany, cycling in Brittany, keep listening and you'll hopefully have your questions answered. But I just want to point out one thing before we start. I noticed this when we exchanged a couple of emails before this, and I keep all the emails for different people who appear in the podcast in separate files. Tim is a very, very popular name for cycle tourists. I've had on the podcast Tim McKenna, he was on the first one, Tim Moore, the writer, Tim Ralph, who is a guy who's a mountaineer actually, but he's also a cycle tourist, Tim Moss of the Cycle Touring Festival, and even Timmy Mallet. So you're in good company. There's an expression. It's not quite the same, but when your name determines what job you do, it's not quite like that. But clearly, there's something in the name Tim that would lead you perhaps into becoming a cycle tourist.
Yeah, I think about it. I wouldn't say it's a particularly common name. I've not worked with a lot of Tims, but maybe they're all out on their bikes.
Perhaps it's a certain generation thing, because thinking about that list of people, they're all probably roughly, Tim Moss is probably a bit younger, but they're all kind of a similar generation, so perhaps it's to do with that as well. So you went to Brittany last summer. Can you just, to begin with, just talk about what was the plan? How did you travel there? What was the plan? How long were you there? And what did you intend to do?
So my basic aim was to go on my first unsupported solo cycle tour outside the UK. So what I wanted to find was somewhere that I could reach relatively easily using public transport, somewhere where I was reasonably confident I could find my way around, but also somewhere that had lots of interesting places to look at and historical sites. Because I guess for me, cycle touring's more a means to an end than an end in itself. And I like to plan tours that go to interesting places where I can stop off and have a look. So that was the basic sort of idea, was to find somewhere easily reachable from the UK and somewhere that looked interesting. I'd never been to Brittany before, but I had looked at the Vélodyssée as a potential cycle route for the future. For those that don't know, that's France's longest waymarked cycle ride. I think it goes almost some 1,200 kilometres from the French Channel coast right the way down to the Spanish border and in the Pyrenees. And so I'd looked at that, and that gave me an idea that I could travel certainly some way through Brittany following that route. But then I wanted to find some way of turning around and coming back by different methods. So I did a bit of research, and I found that the Vélodyssée, it leaves from Roscoff and it heads down across the peninsula down to the Loire Valley. And there are other French cycle routes that you can then come back and return on, and end up back at Saint-Malo, which is clearly another ferry ride from the UK. So the basic idea was ferry to Roscoff from Plymouth, cycle for roughly 14 days, doing a figure eight, get down as far as the Loire Valley, and then come back to Saint-Malo and catch the ferry back to Portsmouth.
Yeah, I'm looking at the map now. So basically, like you say, it's a bit of a figure of eight without the top bit, because you you arrived in Roscoff and then presumably you went back home from Saint-Malo. Is that right?
Yeah, from Saint-Malo to Portsmouth.
The bottom bit of the figure of eight, you come back to a place called Redon in the middle, and that's the route that you took. So basically, you're following the EuroVelo one or the Vélodyssée to Redon, and then you're following the coast down to Nantes, and then on a route back from Nantes up to Saint-Malo. So how long did it take you in the end?
So that's 14 days of cycling, not necessarily full-on cycling every day. Some days were no more than half a day's cycle ride. Others took me most of the day to do.
And to what extent was it planned? Had you planned out every night of accommodation, for example? Had you planned out all the distances, or were you just making it up as you go along?
Because it was my first trip, I was probably being fairly risk averse. So I had actually booked the hotels in advance. Hadn't necessarily selected the exact route I was going to go each day. I had some ideas, and certainly where I was thinking, where there were sites that I wanted to head to that were off the main routes, then I'd planned sort of diversions to get to them. So there was a bit of flexibility there, but I knew where I was moving on to each day. The French have a scheme called EuroVelo, which basically means welcome cyclist. And so you can get there. They have a whole list of hotels and campsites where they're all within easy reach of their main cycle routes. So, and they've got secure bike accommodation. So I used the EuroVelo website to basically select hotels and then book them online.
And did you find? I mean, you were travelling in, was it June last year?
End of June, beginning of July.
So did you find the availability? Was that not a problem?
I think there was only one place, that was Carhay, where there was only one hotel that was on the list, and that didn't have a lot of space left. So that was one I had to book in advance. And also, there's a little town called Blaine that's halfway between Nantes and Redon on the way back, and that only seemed to have one hotel in it as well. So those places were a bit of a choke point that I got booked first, and then I planned the rest of it around that.
And what were your preconceptions about Brittany? What did you think it would be like?
I thought it would be probably a bit like cycling round Cornwall, Devon, sort of the southwest of England. I've done a bit of that sort of. I cycled from Land's End to Carlisle a couple of years back, so I'd cycled through parts of Cornwall and Devon before, and I thought it was going to be similar to that in terms of the scenery, the sort of the type of places you could visit. Turned out to be very different from how I'd imagined, and a lot better as it turned out. So that was good.
For people who are not particularly familiar with Brittany, it kind of holds a special place in kind of the French nation. Can you explain why?
It's almost a separate culture, I think, within France. It didn't actually become part of France until probably around about 1500. Before that, it was a separate duchy with its own laws, its own rulers. Yes, it was technically sort of subservient to the French crown, but other than that, it looked after itself and wasn't really regarded as part of France. And it wasn't until the last sort of survivor, the Duchess in Brittany, of the line, she married the French king, and the two parts actually came together at that point. So until then, yes, it was entirely separate. I think the other thing that sets it apart is it's actually Celtic. So there's often talk about the six Celtic nations, sort of the ones you might think of, like sort of Wales and Ireland and Scotland. They also include the Isle of Man. They also include Cornwall. And they also include Brittany as being a Celtic nation. And to some extent, the sort of proof of that is in the name. In French, Brittany is Bretagne, and Great Britain is Grand Bretagne. And there's always been a very close link between the two. A lot of the settlers in Brittany in the sort of round about the 6th century actually came from Britain. And so that's created a very different culture from the rest of France.
Yeah, I cycled. Well, Brittany was part of my cycle during the summer of 2022. I was there a few weeks after you arrived. I was there towards it was the middle bit of July, just after that very, very hot period, both in Britain and in France. And I remember having to keep reminding myself that I was actually in France, because you see the signs are all in two languages, and the feeling of the place, it's a very different place. Geographically, it has a different look to it, very different from what I was used to elsewhere in France.
Yes, and I think it's, as you say, there's lots of Zs on the road signs, which is probably the first thing you notice. But yeah, the food. Well, the food is still very quite French, but it has its own Breton characteristics. They drink cider as well as wine. They've got their own specific types of pancakes. So there's a lot of difference there. The music as well. The Bretons play bagpipes, which comes as a bit of a surprise when you're sitting in sort of in a village square in the centre of Brittany, and you suddenly hear bagpipes coming out of the church, which happened to me.
Yeah. Did you hear much Breton being spoken when you were there?
I don't think I did actually. I mean, I was mostly conversing in French and a little bit of English, but I don't remember actually hearing much Breton being spoken.
Okay, so you arrive in Roscoff. Your first mission is to obviously find the Vélodyssée, the EuroVelo one. I did actually go to Morlaix, which is slightly to the south of Roscoff. I decided not to go up to Roscoff because basically I would have been going up to Roscoff, turning around and then coming back and following the same route down. Somebody did say to me, "Oh, you've missed a treat there," because that bit between Roscoff and Morlaix is particularly beautiful. Did you find that to be the case?
Yeah, I mean it's very different from the rest of the Vélodyssée because, or certainly the bit of the rest of the Vélodyssée I followed in Brittany. You're mostly following the estuary of the river, So you're heading down the coast. You're on minor roads that are going through sort of undulating countryside, whereas a lot of the rest of the Vélodyssée is either on old railway tracks or canal towpaths. So it's a different sort of cycling, and it's very pastoral. The main crop of that part of Brittany is basically vegetables, and you cycle past amazing fields full of artichokes, which certainly is nothing I'd ever seen before. These sort of purple-headed flowers sort of looking out at you. And Roscoff itself it's very pretty in a very simple way. It's quite a shock to the system when you sort of come. It's not actually on the Vélodyssée. You have to sort of the Vélodyssée starts at the ferry port, but you can sort of drop down into the town and have a look around, and you suddenly get hit with a sense of age, which is something that then follows on through the rest of Brittany. But you've got cobbled streets, you have sort of 16th, 17th century shipmasters' houses, an absolutely beautiful church. It's very, very different to sort of that sense of age just catches you immediately you get there.
So you head down to Morlaix. Morlaix is quite an impressive place with that viaduct, that railway viaduct in the middle of the town. It's a dominant feature.
It is, yeah. I mean, you basically you come down the Vélodyssée, you turn a corner, and there is in front of you, and it just gets bigger as you get closer to it. The town itself is full of these beautiful what are called pondelay houses, which basically they were built by linen merchants, and you could tell that linen made Morlaix a lot of money in the sort of 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, because they are absolutely gorgeous to go inside. I don't know if you managed to get inside one when you were in Morlaix, but you go inside and they've got these. They're probably 3 stories high. There's an atrium that goes all the way up to the top of the building, so full 3 stories sort of ceiling above you, and then a beautiful carved wood staircase, sort of spiral staircase, just going straight up the middle with all these hardwood corridors going off it. And it's a very unique style of sort of building.
Yeah, actually, come to think of it, I did, because I went to the tourist office, and the tourist office was in one of those buildings, and it a very impressive building, and what you've just described there is very reminiscent of what I saw inside that building. Now, in Morlaix, you pick up the Vélodyssée, or you continue along the Vélodyssée, but you mentioned a few minutes ago the railway network, because the Vélodyssée does use a lot of disused railway tracks, especially in that first part as you're heading down to Redon. What's the history there of the railway tracks?
So when probably if you go back to the 19th century, then a lot of the transport links around Brittany were around the coast, and the towns in the middle like Carhaix were fairly cut off and they were quite difficult to get to, and so the local towns got together and decided to invest in their own railway network, and it ended up being 5 lines hubbed out of Carhaix, one of which went to Morlaix. So most of the traffic on it was agricultural, potatoes, farm machinery, things like that. But eventually, as the roads opened up the interior of Brittany, then it started losing money, and it got closed down almost about the same time as the railways got closed down in this country under Beeching. But luckily, they grabbed the sort of the lines and turned them into greenways. So when you head out of Morlaix, you go up quite a steep sort of incline at first, and then you're on this nice, beautifully gradual railway sort of bed that takes you all the way up into the through the Mont d'Arrée. So the high point of it, you really don't. Once you've got at that first climb, you really don't notice you're climbing. It's such a nice, gentle sort of cycle.
Yeah, well, that's the great thing about disused railway tracks, isn't it? That that incline, or those inclines, are just so gentle that basically, well, they've got to be like that for the trains to get up there when they originally carried trains. But very often you have to double check on if you're tracking your route on Strava or whatever you're using, and you look at the profile, and it always gives you this very perfect incline. It's a marvel of the engineering feats of the time that they were able to, in such a precise, continuous way, build these tracks that were able to just gradually go up or go down in such a precise way.
It was also the first point at which you notice how much wildlife there is in Brittany. I think that was the other thing that stood out for me. And you're cycling up through the woods, and there were birds, there were woodpeckers, there were thrushes, there were blackbirds just sort of flitting in and out through the trees. And it felt like there was a much greater density of bird life there than I've probably noticed in this country when I've been out cycling.
Were you not tempted to head down to Brest and then follow the coast? Or was it always going to be the Vélodyssée?
I think because the Vélodyssée was what started me looking at Brittany, I was just looking at ways I could get back rather than necessarily going too far off. And plus, there were quite a few places that I wanted to see that were just off the Vélodyssée route as well. So it fitted with the length of time I was cycling for and the sort of places I wanted to find. It does mean I've got the option of going back to the west of Brittany on another trip if I want to.
So you stayed in Carhaix and then headed down to Pontivy, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, right, yes.
At what point do you join the Canal?
So the canal is just south of Carhaix. So I've spent the night in Carhaix, and it's probably about another 5 kilometres south of Carhaix to get onto the canal. And then if you're following the Vélodyssée strictly, you're basically on it for the next. Well, you could be on it for the next 5 days, all the way to Nantes if you really wanted to. I did move on and off the route on occasions just to find other places and to sort of. It gets a bit monotonous. I mean, the cycling's really easy. It's not like you're cycling along a UK sort of canal towpath where you can be sometimes taking your life into your hands. It's wide, it's well graded, but I quite like to sometimes get a bit of variety as well.
And what's the history of that canal, the Nantes-Brest Canal?
So it dates back to Napoleon. It dates back to his war with Britain. And while at the earliest parts of that war, Britain blockaded Brest and Lorient, the two big ports out on the West Brittany coast. And Britain starved the garrisons out. So Napoleon decided that he didn't want that to happen again. So he ordered the construction of a canal effectively inland all the way to Brest. Rather than build a brand new sort of cut all the way through, what they actually did was they took the existing rivers and then cut canals over the watersheds between them. So if you actually look at the map, you'll see that it follows the rivers quite closely. In a lot of cases, it is actually the river that they've canalised. And then you'll suddenly get to a point where it will just go straight up over the watershed, through the top of the watershed and down the other side. And it's those bits that were the big engineering feats, I suppose, of building the canal. The one that's at Glomel is probably the most well known. I mean, they call them trenches, and the reason why they call them trenches is because they literally cut down into the top of the hill to cut across the top of the watershed. So the one at Glomel is something like 3 kilometres long. It's about 35 metres deep and about 100 metres wide, which means that in order to sort of do it, they probably removed about 10 million cubic metres of earth. And in order to do that, they effectively used what was almost slave labour. They actually used convicts and deserters, stuck them in a prison camp close to the trench, and made them work for next to nothing to actually dig the canal. And by all accounts, it was a pretty horrendous place to be sort of held for the duration of the works.
Yeah, and the thing that struck me when I was cycling down it was the fact that there was so little boat traffic, and I couldn't really figure out why, but there is a good reason why. Can you explain?
Yeah, so come about the mid 1900s, they decided to build a hydroelectric power dam and they use the valley sort of lower down, just east of Gouarec, to build it. And so you've now got Brittany's largest hydroelectric power station, dam sort of that can supply 7,000 homes, sitting across the canal, and 17 of its locks are buried under the under Lake Guardelin. When they built it, they decided not to build a boat lift to bring boats up it. So effectively, it cut the canal in half. So you see quite a few boats on the southern bit below the lake, and you may well see ones closer to Brest on the other side. I didn't go that far west, but certainly the bit in the middle, which is, to be honest, quite remote, I saw virtually no traffic on at all.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I just couldn't figure it out. I thought, well, if this is in Britain or anywhere else, there would be tourist traffic left, right, and centre. But then, obviously, when you get to the lake, you figure out why that's the case. Back to Tim in a few moments. We're going to hear from Geoff Husband in a few moments, but before we do, a quick reminder: if you'd like to get in contact with the podcast, you can do so by going to cyclingeurope.org/contact, and all the contact details are there. Find us on social media at Cycling Europe. And if you'd like to support the podcast, you can find all the details as to how to do that by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're going to hear from Geoff Husband. I met Geoff last summer, and I literally bumped into him. Well, almost. He was coming in the opposite direction on his Solex near the campsite that he runs near Gouarec. Tuesday morning. I have to say Tuesday is one of my favourite days in France because everything reopens after Sunday and Monday. So it's a bit of a relief that you can actually do things and buy things. But anyway, I'm just wheeling the bike down the side of the canal from the campsite at Gouarec, where I stayed last night, and Tim Sanders, who's my official, I don't know, campsite advisor on this trip, he had been here himself more than once, I think, in the past, and he messaged me this morning saying, have you met Geoff? I said, well, who's Geoff? Anyway, he said he was the English chap who used to run the site, and there was a chap turned up in a car this morning while I was eating the breakfast that they put on at the campsite, €4, very good value, eat what you like. And I said, are you Geoff? And he said, yes, he was. And I had a really nice chat with Geoff, and he was explaining to me that he'd lived in France for 32 years. It used to be a municipal campsite here, but Geoff. Sorry to interrupt you. I make a podcast called the Cycling Europe Podcast.
All right, go ahead.
And I'm just recording basically my what I've just said, or what you said in your conversation with me a few minutes ago.
Oh, right, okay.
Have you got 2 minutes just to chat to me?
Yeah,
so
sure.
Would you mind just explaining, or rather, could you start by introducing yourself?
Oh, right, okay. I'm Geoff Husband, and I've been running a company called Breton Bikes for 32 years now, offering cycle camping holidays in Brittany.
But you also now run the campsite here at Gouarec?
Yeah, for the last 6 years we've taken it over and turned it into a cyclist campsite.
Well, I'm going to say it is very, very cycling friendly.
Yeah.
So what have you done to make it cycling friendly?
Well, you know what it's like when you arrive at a campsite and there's no cover and there's no plastic chairs or anywhere to sit or stuff like that. Well, we've got all that, but we've also put in a kitchen or 2 kitchens for people. There's loads of covered spaces, and I do free maintenance for people most of the time. Carry spares and stuff like that. So
you put on that cracking breakfast, which was very popular this morning with the cyclists.
Yeah, well, we're not really a cafe, but we just lay out loads of stuff, and for €4 you take whatever you want.
You're probably breaking lots of French health.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think this is why we do it this way, is sort of a way around it, because in a way we're acting as a shop, because we don't serve anybody.
Yeah.
People just help themselves, so therefore we're not serving.
Yeah,
So we're not a cafe.
Very clever.
Yeah.
Well, it was a fantastic breakfast, and it's going to take me a few hours to work that off. And the other thing that we were talking about earlier is the canal.
Yeah.
Because one thing I mentioned on this podcast a while back, or yesterday when I was recording, is that it just seemed very, very quiet of traffic. And you were explaining to me why there is no traffic here.
Yeah, in the canal was built about, off the top of my head, about 1836, I think it was opened, and it was the last canal built. And then the railways came within sort of 20 years, took a lot of the traffic. But the big thing was in the 1930s they built a dam here because it wasn't used that much. They built a dam, so it's broken in the middle, so it can't carry traffic from Nantes to Brest as it did before, and it sort of fell into disrepair beyond Pontivy, and beyond the dam, and it's always struggled with its water supply. It's such a huge engineering feat to get it to go over well over 1,000 or up to 1,000 feet. It's there just isn't enough water. So even in the 1850s, they closed the canal in summer.
But you were saying that they are trying to encourage some traffic, some tourist traffic, presumably.
Yeah, they're redoing quite a lot of the locks, so west of the Lac de Gourladan now, you can go about 10-15 kilometres, but then they'll start to hit low bridges and things like that, which make it more complicated. So I think we're probably getting to as far as it's going to get from the lake.
And obviously the Vélodyssée, the EuroVelo one, passes or uses a lot of the Brest Canal.
Yeah, it takes a big chunk of it.
So you must get a lot of passing trade just by people thinking, oh look, there's a campsite.
Yeah, and the V6 as well. So we're actually at the crossroads between the Vélodyssée and the V6, which runs Loire and sort of due east, whereas the Vélodyssée takes you down the west coast.
But you were also saying that you think it's a pity that people don't have the opportunity, if they stick rigidly to the EuroVelo one, the Vélodyssée, they don't have an opportunity to discover perhaps other bits of Brittany. Yeah,
it's it obviously attracts people to the area, but one of the problems is loads of people have guides and maps and they just show the cycle routes. You know, it's like a narrow strip. And you don't realise that off the canal there's fantastic little country lanes with nothing on them that go village to village to village. And the canal is fantastic, but for a cyclist like you and me, sometimes it just gets a bit, you're in the same position on the bike, you pedal. There's none of that sort of up and down rhythm, getting a rest, getting pumped up a hill and things like that. Yeah. So I'd like to encourage everybody to go, get a Michelin map and go a little further afield. Don't be frightened to dive off.
And you envisage just continuing to run the campsite for the rest of your days?
Well, I'm 62 now, so for the next 3 years. After that, I think it'll be handed over to the team I'm training up. You may have noticed we've got a fantastic team, and they're just as enthusiastic as us, and so I don't think anything will change.
Well, I mean, it's a fantastic site for cyclists. It's a brilliant location, and the breakfast in itself is just worth coming for €4. You can't really go wrong, can you?
No, okay.
So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks again to Geoff for allowing me to accost him on the street like that. He runs Breton bikes, and you can find their website at bretonbikes.com. He also manages the campsite at Gouarec, and you can find details about that by visiting Campine de Gouarec, that's GOUAREC.com. Now, back to my chat with Tim Boden. Just south of that lake, you get to a place called Jocelyn. Now, I used to live in France, and I had never heard of Jocelyn in all the years that I lived there. And when I got there, I thought, this is bizarre. Why have I never heard of this? Because it's a beautiful, beautiful little place. Can you explain some of the history of that place?
Yeah, so Jocelyn was a pretty minor town until the Breton War of Succession. The Breton War of Succession was fought for about 10 years. It was a kind of like a subplot of the 100 Years' War between France and England. And one of its famous generals was basically on the side of the French king, or at least the French king's candidate. And he was basically a guy called de Clisson, and he, because the French king's candidate eventually won, he got the favour of the French king and became the constable of France. And amongst other things, he bought the lordship of Jocelyn as part of that. And he set about rebuilding the chateau, which had been effectively demolished as part of the war. And you get this absolutely amazing sort of view from the bridge as you come into Jocelyn, of this beautiful towered, what you think is a complete castle overlooking the river. You actually go up into the town, and the town in itself is definitely worth spending time, because it's lots of medieval streets, half timbered houses, painted in all the woods, painted in lots of different colours. There's a glorious basilica in the middle, which is actually where de Clisson's mausoleum is, and there's stained glass sort of commemorating him all the way around the basilica. And in fact, you can go up the tower of there and actually get a bird's eye view of the whole town. And that's when you notice that the chateau actually only has one wall. The other walls were basically demolished by Cardinal Richelieu about sort of 200 years later, when he had an argument with the then Duke. But anyway, so you can then go down to the chateau, and you can look around, and it's this beautiful Renaissance building on the one side that's left, formal rose gardens. But it just has a real sense of peace. I mean, I could have spent a lot more time looking around. I had half a day, which was a good enough start, but it's actually beautiful. And then to cap it all, I went into the town for my tea that night, walked back down to the bridge, and I had a rainbow all the way over the river and the castle. So it made almost the perfect sort of picture. So it's definitely a place that's fond in my memory.
I found the canal after Jocelyn. That was the bit that got a bit kind of, oh, come on, I'm desperate now for a bit of change of scenery. I kept going to Redon, and then I jumped on a train to take me down to the Loire estuary, just to the west of Nantes. But when you got to Redon, you headed west towards the coast.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I did a couple of diversions before I even got to Redon. Like you, I was getting a bit bored of cycling on the canal, so I headed off to a little hilltop village called Roscoff, which was absolutely beautiful as well. But you're right, when I got to Redon, you pick up the Vilaine River, and there's another route which is called Route 42. It's a regional route which heads from there right the way down the Vilaine River to Arzel, which is kind of the end of the estuary. It was one of these really lucky sort of things that I'd looked it up on the thing, and you look on the cycle.travel website and it's a dotted line. And certainly if you look on the internet for Route 42, you'll find that it stops at Redon. But I sort of cycled out, just about to sort of pick up the little roads, and then I saw a signpost for it. So I thought, I'll follow it and see where it goes. And I just had a whole day of just beautiful gravel track riding. Nothing difficult, lots of nicely graded tracks going through the countryside, a few minor roads through a town called La Roche-Bernard that overlooked the estuary, and then right the way down to the Arzel Dam. It was just one of those days I hadn't expected, that sort of, there's a signpost, let's see where it goes.
And that bit of the coast between the Arzel Dam and Saint-Nazaire that you cycled down, is that very different to the coast, the Brittany coast that you experienced between Roscoff and Morlaix?
Yes, I mean, it's different for several reasons. I mean, firstly, there's not really much in the way of agriculture. The inland part of the land is, a lot of it's salt marsh. So really pretty much all the communities are facing out towards the sea there. So you get a mixture of really pretty little villages on the coast. But then there's a lot of mussel sort of mariculture going on. So you'll see these large arrays of sticks being stuck into the seabed as you cycle along, and sort of big sort of square patches, and that's where basically they're growing mussels to then harvest them for the for the restaurants inland. You then get places like Gouarec, which is a beautiful walled city just in the middle of nowhere, that's commanding, and you sort of wonder why they went to the effort of sort of securing it. But then when you drop down to the bay just below it, they have these salt marshes, and the salt marshes have been basically commercialized for the production of salt for, well, certainly since medieval times. So when you cycle out across them, there's probably anything up to about 10,000 rectangular mud banks filled with salt water, and they basically evaporate off the salt over the summer. And so it's still done in a very traditional manner. It's actually sort of, the jobs are segregated by gender. The women sort of they scrape the sort of the really clean white salt off the surface of the ponds, and the men use rakes to dig up the grey salt off the bottom. And that trade has been going, as I say, since medieval times, and they used to ship the salt all the way up river, up the Vilaine and up the Loire. So there was a lot of wealth in Gouarec, which is one of the reasons they built the walls there.
Yeah, and salt used to be kind of the gold of its day, didn't it? It was very, very valuable.
That's right. And then that leads on to a more interesting bit of coastline, which is called the Côte Sauvage, which is a whole string of little bays, low cliffs, lots of seabirds nesting on them. And it's called the Côte Sauvage because in winter the storms come straight off the Atlantic and bash into that. So you wouldn't want to be stuck in a ship just off the coast. So you follow that round, and eventually you get to the big resorts dating back to the sort of 19th century with long sandy beaches, and then eventually you get to Saint-Nazaire.
Mm-hmm. And Saint-Nazaire obviously is right at the end of the Loire. Your plan then was to get as far as Nantes on the southern side of the Loire. How did you actually manage to cross? Because that bridge is not the most cycle-friendly of bridges to get to the south side of the Loire estuary.
That's right. I mean, they don't ban you from cycling across it, and I've certainly read of people who have, but it's probably less than a metre wide cycle lane that isn't segregated from the traffic. Then you've got cars and lorries and buses going at 70, 80 kilometres an hour, and there could be quite likely to be crosswinds as well. So I certainly wouldn't advise cycling across it. So instead, they've made it very easy to get public transport. Throughout the year, there's a stage bus that goes from Saint-Nazaire to Saint-Brevin on the other side, and literally they've got 8 bike racks on the back of the bus. So you turn up and the driver loads your bike onto the back of the bus and drives you across the bridge. In the summer, there's also a minibus service that I suspect does something very similar, but it was too early in the summer for me to catch that. So I just used the stage bus. So for the grand total of €2.40, it got me across safely, which I thought was good value, really.
So had you stayed in Saint-Nazaire? Where did you stay that night?
To be honest, I just stayed in a Holiday Inn Express there. I sort of, it was just a normal hotel, so I could just wander around the town and look at the restaurants. There are the submarine pens there that people look around, but there isn't much else to see in Saint-Nazaire because it was almost completely destroyed in World War II. It was the last place actually in France to surrender to the Allies at the end of World War II. So as a result of which it really did suffer a lot of bombing, and there wasn't a lot left.
Now I'm just looking down your list of start points and finish points, and your distances. What was the average? Did you work out the average overall?
It's going to be about 60 to 65 kilometres, I think. I mean, I had a couple of longer days that were up nearer the 90 kilometre mark and a few shorter ones that down 50. So I'd have said 60 to 70 is probably the average. Certainly I did just over 800 kilometres in 14 days.
And basically now you're more or less at the halfway point. you've got to Saint-Nazaire, you've crossed the bridge, you're heading down towards Nantes, at which point you're going to head north again. Now, the Loire Vélo, EuroVelo 6, that will obviously take you as far as Nantes. But north of Nantes, is there a route that you can follow?
From Nantes, I was actually back on the Vélodyssée again. So I actually took the Vélodyssée back to Redon.
Oh, of course, yes. Were you back on the Canal?
I was back on the Canal, yes. It's sort of, I think that's probably I would say the least interesting bit of the ride. It's the canal. There's very little off the canal to go and see more interesting sights. So I basically cycled as slowly as I could and just enjoyed the scenery. There was lots of flowers, lots of birds, no breath of wind. So the canal in the mornings was just a mirror. So basically slowed down and just pottered along wherever I had a chance to go off and have a look at things. I mean, there was a market day in La Chapelle that was just north of Nantes. So I sort of came off the canal there and just had a wander around the markets and bought myself a bag of cherries and a baguette and for lunch and just sat down and enjoyed them. But so yes, it's not you could almost push yourself through to Redon in one day, but I took two over it and just sort of slowed down and enjoyed it.
And when you got to Redon, did you stay in the same place that you'd stayed in when you came down?
Yes, yeah. The hotel I'd stayed in on the way down was fine. I mean, it was one of these EuroVelo hotels, so it had a nice sort of coal store around the back that people put their bikes in. So nice and secure, and it was close to the centre. So yes, I just stayed in the same hotel.
Is that basically what they do, the EuroVelo? Do they have guaranteed facilities for bikes?
They have to have secure storage for bikes to be part of the scheme. A lot of cases, it would be an outhouse of some description. A couple of times it was parked outside but in a secure yard. One hotel, it was in the middle of one of their conference rooms, so I'm not quite sure what they'd have done if there'd been a conference on. There was only one hotel where the bikes were actually left in a public place, and that was they were actually parked in the breakfast room, which seemed to be a bit strange, with lots of people walking past them. They could have only got out past reception, so I suppose that would have been secure. And then the last place I stayed in Saint-Malo, I mean, it was secure. You just had to use the underground car park, and they charged you for the pass to the underground car park, which I thought was a bit much. But apart from that, everywhere else, there was secure storage for free.
So you're now on that final section. I think it took you 3 days altogether to get from Redon to Saint-Malo via ferry, but you went via Rennes and Dinan. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
How did you get on with that section?
The first thing I did actually was divert. There is a route that basically follows the Vilaine River all the way to Rennes, but I diverted off that because there's a big sort of site for megaliths up on the Neolithic sort of megaliths up on the hills above or just out of Redon. So it's called the Landes de Caujou, and it's probably got the biggest concentration of monuments in Brittany outside of Carnac. I went up there and I saw the ones that were close to the road. There's something like a 7-kilometre trail you can walk around to see all the different sanctuaries and sort of temples and alignments of stones. But I just went up there just to have a look at the ones I could see easily. It was actually quite different. It was almost a bit like Exmoor up there. It was a really sort of big, sandy, heather-covered moorland. So I went there first, then I dropped down back to the river, followed the river into Rennes. Rennes' another beautiful city. Lots of interesting sort of cathedrals and sort of medieval houses to look at, and it's where the Houses of Parliament of Brittany moved to after unification. So there's a very impressive Parliament building there. And then on up another canal. So this time it's the Canal de Ile-Rance, which basically similar to the other one, it joins the River Eel with the River Rance with another flight of locks over a watershed. And that took me to Dinan. And Dinan is a joint with Jocelyn, really, in my favourite places to stay on the tour. It just has this amazing. Well, firstly, it's another walled city. So there's ramparts that you can walk all the way around, and you've got these glorious views up the Rance estuary towards Saint-Malo. But then there's lots of really nice sort of medieval buildings. It's a pedestrianised centre. You get a real sense of, I don't know, an old city that's there, and there's lots of little artisan shops, so it's really good for picking up souvenirs to take home now that you've only got one day to cycle. So yeah, I really like Dinan, and then from Dinan, it's basically another railway line that you follow. You drop down to the estuary and then follow the another railway line to Dinard, which is basically the twin sort of city of Saint-Malo. It's just on the other side of the Ranch estuary. And Dinard's one of these fashionable resorts that's full of Belle Epoque villas. And then you just catch the ferry over the estuary, so you come into Saint-Malo, sort of underneath the battlements and the ramparts, which is quite an impressive way to finish.
Yeah, you made the right decision there, because I passed through Saint-Malo last summer, but I made the rather stupid. Well, it wasn't a decision. I just didn't know that the ferry between Saint-Malo and Dinard existed. I was following the Vélo Maritime, and it wanted to take you all the way down the east side of the estuary, and then take you across probably somewhere not that far from Dinard, and then all the way back up north.
Yeah, it goes over the dam. There's a barrage across the estuary, and I think they take you over the dam.
Well, I didn't want to go all the way down there, and so I risked it. There's a barrage just to the south of Saint-Malo, and it was a horrible experience, a horribly busy road. But yeah, I wish I'd known about that ferry from Saint-Malo to Dinard, because that would have been a far, far better way of doing it. So yeah, you made the right decision there. Just one question regarding travelling from Redon up to Saint-Malo. Were you following a particular named route there?
Yeah, so it's actually Route 42 again. It's the bit that is open on the internet. Sort of Saint-Malo to Redon is Route 42. So, and I think it's also might be one of the Brittany regional routes, something like number 2 or something like that. But it's a very similar style of route to the Vélodyssée, in the sense it's primarily along the side of the waterway. So, and you've got a big towpath again that you follow. There's lots of little. It's a very pretty valley actually that takes you up to Rennes. It's got lots of mills and water wheels, and I saw big fields of sunflowers, and it gets quite tight in a couple of places as you go through this as the river cuts through the hills. So it's a different sort of scenery to following the Vélodyssée along the Canal. It does really feel like you're following a river valley upstream to Rennes. It's very, very nice.
And a great place to finish, Saint-Malo. Saint-Malo's a fantastic place.
It is, and I mean the walled city. I mean it's a miracle that it survived the bombardment in World War II by some means or other. Although the town was a firestorm, I think at one point, the ramparts actually survived. It's quite interesting. I was reading a book the other week, which is quite a famous one, called "All the Light We Cannot See," and it's actually set in Saint-Malo in World War II. So having been there just a few months ago, it was quite interesting to see the actual blitz in Saint-Malo described from the sight of somebody who was in there. But yeah, it's a beautiful little town as well, and again, a lot of it had to be rebuilt post-war. I think the cathedral lost its spire, so they've had to put a new spire on the cathedral. A lot of the houses, you kind of realise you're looking at a medieval house, then it merges almost seamlessly into a modern house, and it's clear that they've just sort of basically rebuilt what they can. But again, really nice place.
Yeah, I think they've actually done a really good job of rebuilding it, because you can tell which are the old buildings and the more modern buildings, but it's not done in a brutal, ugly way. The buildings inside the walled city are, even the modern ones, I think, are just perfectly in tune with the old stuff, and I think they've done a fantastic job of actually rebuilding the old city.
Yeah, I mean, if you contrast that with Saint-Nazaire, I mean, Saint-Nazaire was probably the only town city that I cycled through that didn't have a character. It just felt like soulless suburbs, and that so clearly it was all completely rebuilt, but it hasn't maintained that same sense of place that Saint-Malo has maintained.
If you were to do the whole trip again, is there anything that you would change? Anything you'd do differently? Anywhere where you would definitely say, "Yep, I'm going to go there," or spend more time there?
I'd definitely spend more time in Nantes. I mean, I really only had a half an afternoon to do a very quick tour around Nantes, and there was a lot more I could have done in Nantes. I think I'd always go back to Jocelyn and Dinan. I think those two town cities were beautiful. I did find cycling along the canals, it gets you through the countryside quickly and it's very pretty and it's traffic free, but I did like breaking up the journey a bit. And there were a couple of days where I spent most of the day along the canal and I just felt like I was putting my head down and and sort of pushing the pedals around just to get to the other end of it. So I think I'd try and find a few more diversions off the canal. There are some beautiful places. I mean, we didn't mention Plavongen, sort of just south of Morlaix, which has this absolutely amazing monumental Calvary and a Breton sort of parish close church. So there's lots of places you could go to that weren't far off. So I think I'd probably do a little more research and find a few more places to spend time at. The other place I passed through very quickly that I think I could have spent more time in was Hugoat, which is again sort of between Morlaix and Carhaix, and it's a really nice little town set in the hills, surrounded by forests, and there's lots of nice trails around the woods there. But the weather was absolutely horrible when I got it. It was probably the one day when I had a lot of rain, and I didn't fancy walking around slippy, muddy trails in cycling shoes. So I gave that a miss. So I could certainly spend a bit more time in Hugoat as well.
And you've done a fantastic job of actually recording your journey online. There's your website, which is bywaysthroughtime.com, but you've also put together a guide that people can buy, and very cheaply, £2, which I would imagine is a bargain. Did that take much work?
I've probably been working on it on and off through the autumn, and so it's taken a fair bit of time. I mean, the original idea I had was I was thinking about writing a guidebook for the Vélodyssée, because there are no guidebooks in English for the Vélodyssée. There's guidebooks in French and there's guidebooks in Dutch and German, but not in English. But I did a lot of the initial research, thinking that that's what I might try and do. But when I pitched it to Cicerone, they said that they'd already given the contract to somebody else to write a guidebook for it. So I decided that trying to compete with Cicerone probably wasn't a good idea, and instead I changed it around into more a travel log on my journey, and sort of pulled together as much information, because there aren't that many books on Brittany in English. It's surprising when you think how close it is, how easy it is to get to. It's quite hard to find sort of material that sort of says, well, this is what you can do and this is how you can do it. There's lots of good websites, and all of the big French cycle rides have a website that gives you an idea of what you can take on. But to actually pull it together with all the historical things, I was struggling to find anything sort of a good source for it. So that's what gave me the idea to start writing.
I would have thought Cicerone, they probably got space for a cycling guidebook about Brittany in itself, I would have thought.
Yeah, well, I'm now I've got a better idea of it. I might pitch it again to them, but
presumably you knew that you were going to be writing something when you got back. Did that add an extra dimension to the journey because you knew you had to go and do all the research? I mean, you clearly know your stuff, and you've clearly looked into the history, the culture, as well as the places that you visited.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I mean, I'd done a little bit of research before I went. Certainly, in terms of identifying places I wanted to stay and places I wanted to visit off the route. I think if you've got it in your mind that you want to write up something when you get back, then you tend to notice things. So we talked about the Breton railway sort of earlier on in the podcast. Before I went, I just knew I was cycling along a railway line. But when you get back, you think, well, exactly why was that railway line there, and what was the history behind it? So I think it's a combination of doing some research before you go, then actually experiencing it and knowing that, yeah, there's a few things here that are interesting, and then going back and doing a lot more research when you get back. Certainly that's how I like to do it.
Well, thank you for that. That's a fascinating tale. And what's the best way that people can get in contact if they're interested in asking you questions?
Well, certainly through the website, and there's lots of various contact details on there. My email address is on the website, so that's tim.boden@btinternet.com. And yeah, just so happy to receive questions on that, or if people have got any comments or thoughts on the website, I'm happy to receive that as well. Yeah, just to echo, yeah, it's bywaysthroughtime.com.
Yeah, bywaysthroughtime.com. And you've also done something on a site called storymaps.com, which is an interactive version of what you've got on your own website by the looks of it, including video and quite detailed maps by the looks of it.
I suppose one of the things I was thinking about when I was putting the material together is whether it was possible to make a multimedia book. And I found there aren't a lot of examples of books that use sort of more than photographs and text. So I was playing around with the ideas, and I came across the idea of story maps. And it's a relatively new website that's only been going, I think, for about 6 months. But it allows you to not only have texts and photographs and also videos, but also locate them to places on the maps that the site puts up. So yeah, if you've got geolocated photographs, it will position them on the map, and you can then create a sort of an interactive site that allows people to explore and sort of just click on places and go through and look at it themselves. So I think it's a very interesting idea as a way of expanding the type of material that you can use to publish sort of travel journeys.
Do you know if anybody else has put a cycling journey on there? I'm just trying to get to actually the homepage, which doesn't seem that easy to do.
No, that's what the first question I asked them actually was, have you put a search function on it? And they said they've been prioritizing authoring tools over discovery tools. So I think that's a sign of how relatively new it is. So it's very easy to create your own site, and you can obviously then publicize it. It's actually a lot harder to search to see what other people have done. So at the moment, the simple answer is I don't know, but I'm hoping that when they did say that they were hoping to get search tools up this year. So with a bit of luck, that will then allow you to search through and see what other people have written.
Well, I've just managed to find their homepage, storymaps.com, and scrolling down to the bottom, by the looks of it, you can download an app for your phone. So presumably yours will be part of that app, I would have thought.
Yeah. It's there's categories, so you can assign your story map to particular categories, and then you can do a certain limited amount of searching for other material around those categories. But they're very broad categories. There isn't one for cycling. It's basically sort of travel or adventure or exercise. So it's I think it's limited at the moment.
But it's certainly a step up, and it's certainly visually, it's an improvement on. A lot of people still use Crazy Guy on a Bike, which doesn't look as though it's been updated visually since about the 1970s, albeit obviously the internet didn't exist then. So it's more of an interactive and far more visual version of that. So congratulations on managing to produce something which is of good quality by the looks of it.
It's the sort of site where you need to have most of your material worked out. I don't think I'd want to necessarily author it online on the site. I think I'd actually written most of it offline, and then it's quite easy then to upload it.
Okay, well, have you got any more trips planned?
I've sort of probably the thing I'm sort of trying to work through at the moment is My father went on a trip with a cycle touring club in 1953, 70 years ago, which went from Waterloo Station and spent 14 days cycling round the France and Switzerland, sort of starting in Grenoble and finishing somewhere up near the French-Swiss border. And I've got the 1950s equivalent of a blog, which is basically a photo album with lots of writing in it about the weather, about what things were happening. I mean, famously, they cycled across the French-Swiss border on Coronation Day in 1953 in a blizzard. So I've got all these pictures of people in capes and looking rather sorry for themselves in sort of rather horrendous conditions. So I'd quite like to retrace his steps and go back and see what remains of the route that he followed, and see if I can find where some of the photographs were taken and see what they look like 70 years on. I know some of the roads don't exist anymore, but
has anybody pointed out to you that we do have another coronation in 2023?
Yes, it has been pointed out. Unfortunately, it's earlier in the calendar than the late Queen's coronation was. So I suspect the chances of getting caught in bad weather in the French Alps are even higher. So I think I might be putting it off more towards early July, when I stand a chance of doing it. And preferably not cycling through a blizzard.
You could perhaps write to King Charles III and ask him to delay for a couple of months.
I could. I have a feeling that might fall on deaf ears. But
okay, well, thank you, and good luck on your future travels.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being on the podcast.
Big thank you to Tim for taking part. He knows his stuff when it comes to Brittany. Really interesting person to talk to, and I'm sure if you've got any questions about cycling in Brittany, then he'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions. He gave you all the contact details, and if you're planning a trip there, I suggest you get in touch. Now, we haven't quite finished, because we still are to hear from the 3 French cyclists that I met last year, Fabian, Julian and Guillaume. But before we do that, just a reminder that if you want to get in contact, cyclingeurope.org/contact. If you'd like to help support the podcast, cyclingeurope.org/support. And another way in which you can support the podcast is by adding a review or a rating on the podcast service that you're listening to. Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Google, wherever you happen to be listening. It would be much appreciated. Right, you won't hear me at the end, so I'm going to say goodbye before we hear from the 3 French cyclists. But thank you for listening to episode 67. Episode 68 will be out at some point in the next few weeks. So thanks for listening and happy cycling.
Okay, can you just introduce yourself?
With your name and so on. So we are Fabian, Julian and Guillaume. We are at the beginning from La Rochelle. We met there, but we are now in La Rochelle, in Brittany and in Perpignan. And last year we already made a cycling trip from La Rochelle to the middle of France, near Bourges. I did the year before a long trip. And so we start to make this every year, and this year we start from Saint-Jacques-de-la-Mer, and we are just following the coast until we are fed up.
And you're following the Vélo Maritime?
At the beginning, yes, until Roscoff, but then we wanted to go in the Mont d'Arrêt, but they are burning, so we're not sure we can go there. Or they have burned partially. Then to Crozon, and then we will go back to my home, which is in Pontivy, normally.
So this episode of the podcast is about the Vélo Maritime, the EuroVelo 4.
Okay.
So what do you actually think about the route? Have you enjoyed it?
So we just made a short part of the Vélo Maritime because we start just after Saint-Malo. But we enjoy it because the view is great. The coast is wonderful. The sea is something we almost have never seen before, because in La Rochelle the sea is not as great as here. But it's going up and down, up and down, up and down. But it's It's difficult at the beginning, but it's becoming nice. Yes.
Okay. And are there any problems that you've had on the Vélo Maritime?
We lost our road few times, but just few boards were missing maybe, but sometimes it was our mistakes.
Yeah. I think it's been really well signposted.
But it's well signed, yes. With a map plus the board, it's okay, yes.
Yeah. My complaint would be the quality of the roads sometimes compared to other places in France. The roads I think are pretty poor, no?
For us, it's not a problem.
No?
No, we didn't find it so bad.
They're just like English roads.
Yeah, but France is not so rich, you know.
France certainly has better roads than we do back in Britain.
You mean for cycling or what? Or in general?
Anything.
Okay, I don't know. From Saint-Jacques-de-la-Mer until here, we have not been shocked by the quality of the road. Sometimes, yes, but not so much.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if anybody was thinking about doing the Vélo Maritime, what would you say to encourage them to do it?
What I would say to encourage... Anyway, the Vélo Maritime or another road, what I really like here is the coast, because the sea is wonderful. So if you like the wonderful landscapes, it's a place to come. Plus the sea and the ports life and so on. Then you have to be ready to go up and down quite often. Yes, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Okay.
Otherwise, yes, it's. No, it's great. We start to like to go up and down. Okay. At the beginning we suffered a bit, but now it's okay.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.